All right. I think we've got a bulk of folks starting to sign into the Zoom room, which is wonderful. This is our virtual platform to be able to talk to you folks all from home. And we have an exciting lineup tonight. So really want to kind of kick things off here and talk about Denver's historic movie houses, which I think is going to be very, very fun. We have a SCFD poll that we wanted to kick off here. This helps us when we go for funding from SCFD to know that we've done a good job serving all the counties. So Andrea is going to put that up on your screen. If you just tell us where you're signing in from, that helps us with future funding.
Yeah, we already have some responses.
Oh, wonderful. You guys are on it. And then if anybody is new to Zoom, you're welcome to ask me any questions that you're having in the chat. If you're having any trouble too, you all should have received my email in the reminder email that went out yesterday. So feel free to use that if you're having any trouble connecting with us throughout. And then again, because we are recording it, we'll share the recording with you all. So if it does end up that there's a tech issue, we'll make sure that you get to see everything.
All right, I'm gonna let the poll go about 10 more seconds or so. We just had a few more people come in.
Perfect.
All right.
All right, so we are, while that's kind of just finishing up, I'll just talk a little bit about our plan for the evening. We are lucky enough to be joined by two wonderful speakers this evening. Amy Zimmer is going to kick things off, talking a bit about the history of some of our movie houses in Denver. If you're not familiar with Amy's work, she definitely stands on a long career, and I'll go into a little more of her bio in a second. And then Keith Garcia is joining us from the Sea Film Center as well. And so he is going to be our second speaker this evening. They're both open to questions throughout. So if you haven't already discovered where your chat box is, feel free to open that up, park all your questions in there, because I will go ahead and feed those questions to them throughout the program. So that's kind of our run of show for the evening, how we're planning to kick everything off. And then we are starting all our programs with a land acknowledgement. This kind of just acknowledges the respect that we have, that the land we are discussing today is actually the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations, and that it was an important site of trade for numerous other Native tribes. We always want to recognize the Indigenous people as the original stewards of the land that we're discussing, and the fact that their descendants still reside here. So as these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the historic and present ties these nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. So just to give you a little bit more background on Amy, who is our first speaker this evening, she is a historian and writer specializing in Denver's historic architecture. A Colorado native, she spent 7 years on the Denver Landmark Preservation Commission and has won several awards for her work in historic preservation. Amy has read several books on Denver architecture, including local bestsellers Lost in Denver, which is amazing. Some of the photos she got for that book are just absolutely fun to look at, and Denver's historic homes. And she lives in a historic neighborhood. Today, she still lives in the Park Hill neighborhood. And then our second speaker this evening is going to be Keith. Keith Garcia's decade-long career with the Denver Film currently finds him as the artistic director of the Sea Film Center, where his diverse programming keeps audiences on their toes. He's also a filmmaker in his own right, wrapping up work on his forthcoming dragumentary, The Heels Have Eyes, about Denver's vibrant and electric drag performance community, which Keith has been following for almost 12 years. Keith founded Denver Film Cinema Q program, focused on an abundance of LGBTQ plus titles as a monthly program in 2006 that blossomed into a successful and robust film festival in 2008 that will be returning for its 13th celebration later this year. Keith is single, loves pizza, and cohabitates with his longtime feline familiar, Jordan Catalano. So hopefully that gets you all excited about our speakers this evening. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Andrea.
Hello, everyone. Andrea Malcolm, director at the Molly Brown House Museum, of course, historic Denver's flagship property. So I thought I'd just, before we turn it over to our speakers, just sort of let's tie this all together in historic Denver's own history with movies, and of course, Margaret Molly Brown's history with movies. So we're going to hear some of these great old dames that I'm sure Amy and Keith are going to both share more information about. It was in 1964 that the Unsinkable Molly Brown movie made its world premiere at Denver's own Denham Theater. It was this blockbuster musical that, of course, would pave the way just 6 years later for the creation of historic Denver and saving the Molly Brown House Museum in 1970. This theater opened as the Schubert Theater in 1913. It was originally a stage theater with its own orchestra and musicals, and featured plays and vaudeville routines for several decades. In 1932, which was the year that Margaret or Molly Brown's death happened, the Denham was actually converted to a motion picture theater. And it closed its doors for good in November of 1974 and has since been replaced by a parking garage. I thought if you all will indulge me, I would share just a hot minute, a clip of the world premiere. And of course, we always have to get through an ad first, so thank you.
Has finally made an
All right.
Leadville, Colorado, where gold was discovered in the late 1800s, welcomes Leadville Johnny Brown in the person of tall singing star Harvey Presnell, who portrays the fabulous millionaire miner in MGM's The Unsinkable Molly Brown. At famed Little Johnny Mine, he dedicates a plaque marking the entrance to the National Mining Museum. Leadville, population 8,000, has one of its biggest days since miners first struck it rich here, giving America the story now relived on film. The next day in Denver, Molly Brown, in the person of Debbie Reynolds, makes a triumphant return in a World War I period costume of mink-trimmed wool, riding in a vintage car reminiscent of bygone glory. At the charity premiere, cross-plugged by every downtown Denver theater, Hollywood's contingent includes top executives. Here, Robert M. Weichman, MGM studio head. The producer of the film, Lawrence Weingarten, who has some 80 movies to his credit. And now arriving, Harvey Presnell escorting the wife of Colorado's Governor, John A. Love. And arriving with Governor Love, he who enjoys a great triumph as the poor Irish girl who finds riches becomes a darling of the international set and proves she's truly unsinkable by surviving the Titanic disaster.
I love that premiere. Let's see if we can get back to our slide here.
And Andrea, actually, you got a question about that theater and where it was located. Do you know?
You know what? I had it written down at 1 minute and then I forgot. So hopefully Amy can answer that question for us. If not, I'll follow up with that answer when we do our follow-up email.
Perfect.
I believe it was on 15th Street, but I'm forgetting the exact.
Oh, my thing was still going. My apologies. There we go. I love that clip, and it gives you a good sense of some of how dazzling those theaters were in downtown Denver. And one more quick share, of course, Molly Brown, Margaret Brown herself, was no stranger to the stage. She performed here in Denver, New York, Newport, London. So we have some great examples of their performing arts skills as a family that also transitioned into the movie industry. Her son, Larry Lawrence Brown, actually worked in the film industry in the late 1920s with John Gorman Productions. He worked as a general manager on the 1926 silent film Home Sweet Home. And you can actually see there up on the top in the archives of History Colorado are some of the playbills and his contract with John Gorman for this set of films, things like that. And that's also where he met and married his second wife, actress Mildred Gregory, who had starred in Home Sweet Home. He eventually did quit the filmmaking business before taking up mining and sort of stepping into his dad's footsteps. And then, of course, Larry's sister Helen performed a lot and entertained. And then we have the three nieces. Margaret Brown adopted three girls from her brother Daniel after when his wife passed away. And in fact, one of them, Helene Tobin, actually starred on stage in the 1927 production of Cradle Snatchers alongside a budding young actor named Humphrey Bogart. And it was his success in the Cradle Snatchers that led to his, explosion in the Hollywood movie scene. So lots of sort of ties to movies, and also early films and television. One of the nieces had a daughter named Dorothy, and she was, as a young child, starred in the R Gang, which eventually became known as the Little Rascals. So lots of great ties we have at the Molly Brown House Museum that take us to the film industry. And then of course, Historic Denver, after being formed in 1970, has taken on many preservation projects and preservation advocacy. And two theater projects that we can talk about happened in the 1980s. Of course, you recognize the interior on the left of the Mayan Theater, and on the right, the outside of the Paramount Theater. So Historic Denver in the 80s was involved in some of the early negotiation efforts to drum up support for saving the Mayan Theater, and working with Mayor Pena at the time. Pena was one of those who actually helped made a pivotal phone call to stop the wrecking balls. One thing we always want to note is the preservation ordinance wasn't what it is today. So individual landmark designation at the time didn't provide protection from demolition. It only provided a 90-day stay at that point. That was eventually extended to a 1-year stay. And then finally in 2006, the ordinance was amended to provide the same sort of perpetual protection to individual landmarks as contributors in districts. So for instance, that's why the Molly Brown House Museum sits in the Pennsylvania Street Historic District, because that provided a layer of protection that its individual landmark status didn't grant when it was created in 1970. So the heart and passion behind rescuing the Mayan, though, really goes to a group known as the Friends of the Mayan, presided over by Denver lawyer and preservationist Chris Citron. You can see her there on the left. She was known as the godmother of the Mayan Theater. And the Friends really were a community-driven group. They undertook the feasibility studies, the fundraising, and oversaw this unique restoration project of this Art Deco theater. And then in 1984, Historic Denver actually formed the Historic Paramount Foundation and purchased the Paramount Theater. It was designed by Temple Buell, 1930s Art Deco theater. And so we directly acquired this theater in order to preserve it, just like we did with the Dr. Justina Ford home that's now the Black American West Museum. Once the work was completed, we spun the theater off to the Paramount Foundation, but have remained partners ever since, including assistance in preserving things like the historic tapestries inside the theater. So that's sort of how Historic Denver gets to be acquainted with so many theaters here in Denver. I will stop sharing so that we can turn it over to Amy now. And you should have control, Amy. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much. So excited to be here with you today. So I'm going to pull up my screen. Hopefully you can see it. All right. Can everybody see the screen okay?
Yep, you're ready to go, Amy.
Great. So I wanted to start off a little bit with pre-movie days. So, or Denver's interest in performing arts and theater goes way back to the 1860s. So I love this historic photo of Larimer Street, and you see the building with the peaked roof right in the middle there. That is Apollo Hall, and that was kind of the first real theater in Denver. This is at 14th and Larimer, and this photo was taken in the 1860s. And this was, pretty typical of the early Denver days. You had the saloon on the first floor and then the theater on the top floor. And this kind of was the first place to sort of bring that little bit of element of culture. And similar to what we see with movie houses later on, this was a place where it was a place to go for, kind of the nightlife, for the entertainment. Of course, back then you didn't have television and everything like that at home, so going out was more thing, and that kind of paved the way for what would come later with the movie theaters. Just so this is from, if you've been to History Colorado, you've seen their diorama in the lobby. So it's just another view of where Apollo Hall was sat there on Larimer Street in the 1860s. I love that diorama. Look at that for hours. But then after you started having these little theaters, but then one of the really big centers of entertainment got to be the churches. And like, for instance, this one was at 18th and Stout Street. This was the first Baptist church. It was torn down in 1937. But you could see the wonderful pipe organ that they have there. Churches were great places for entertainment, not just church services, but for musical entertainment, because they usually had these great big pipe organs. They usually had also pianos, acoustics for singing, and great big areas for auditorium seating. So it wouldn't just be religious music here. They would often have just recitals and small concerts and things like that. So churches really became kind of a center of musical entertainment and theater, and not theater, but musical entertainment in Denver as the city developed. Then you started getting into the more true theaters, large scale theaters, opera houses. Opera houses were very important in the West because people who had moved from back east were feeling sort of a loss of that cultural refinement that they had left behind in the cities back east. And so we have a lot of places around Colorado, not just Denver, but a lot of small towns where you see they built these really nice opera houses that were kind of one of the central buildings in their downtowns. And in Denver, we had the finest one of all, the Tabor Grand Opera House, 16th and Curtis Streets, which you can see here, built in 1881. And this building kind of extends the theater history of Denver, because you have this beautiful opera house built in 1881, designed by Frank Edbrook and Willoughby Edbrook, brought out here to Denver from Chicago by Horace Tabor to design this building. And a lot of historians will agree this was probably the finest building ever built in Denver. It was extraordinarily luxurious, cost $800,000 to build, which was a hugely enormous sum at the time. It was the most expensive building built in Denver for probably at least a decade after that even. Incredible building. And this kind of spans the history too, because this, after its use as a theater, it went on to become a movie theater. Well, I'll get to that in a little bit. But here's just another view of the Tabor Grand, stereoscope image of the construction, which is kind of fun. Here's a view of the interior. You can see how elegant it was. This was the place to go to in Denver for seeing and being seen. But it was quickly surpassed by other theaters, such as the Broadway Theater, which was in the Metropole Hotel, which you see here, which is on Broadway, which is directly across the street from the Brown Palace, another Frank Edbrook building. This one built about 10 years later, about 1891. And here was the interior of the Broadway Theater. So you didn't really see that much from the outside. It wasn't that grand building from the exterior like the Tabor Grand was, but it was probably even more ornate on the interior. And so this is where the Tabor story starts to change. Tabor himself had lost his fortune in the crash of 1893, the big economic panic that caused so many problems with Denver's or Colorado's mining industry. And once this Denver Broadway Theater was built prior to that, but it was already, the Tabor was already 10 years old by then. It was kind of old news. And so this fancy new theater gets built, and it kind of started getting all the big shows, and the Tabor kind of started getting some of the second-rate stuff. And so you kind of see that as the beginning of the Tabor's transition. We'll revisit that in a second, but another sort of development in what would become the movie industry was the cyclorama movement, which was in the 1880s. So this is the Gettysburg Building, and if you'll recognize some of the other buildings in that picture, like the Equitable Building. So this was on Champa and 17th Street. This is a round-shaped building that was built in 1885, and it was built to house the Gettysburg Cyclorama, which if you ever visit Gettysburg Battlefield in Pennsylvania, you'll see a cyclorama there. And what that is it's a giant painting that's round, and it's not actually a film. It doesn't move, but what you do is you walk around the build or walk around the painting, the circular painting, and you're supposed to feel like you're in the center of the Battle of Gettysburg. And so this was a really popular thing in the 1880s, and sort of almost like our earliest precursor to film, kind of in a way. Now, this building eventually ended up burning down. It was thought to be an arson, burned down in 1905. But it was kind of interesting, and we don't actually know what happened to the huge painting that was in there. It was thought that it was sold to somebody in China, but they're not really sure. It's never really been tracked. But the building was used for various other things, events, and even had a wax museum in there for a while, and different things. An interesting building. But you start to see the development of other theaters downtown. And Andrea and Allison, please let me know if I'm starting to run out of time here. So you see like the Orpheum Theater here, which was built in 1903 at 15th and Welton. And so early 1900s, you started getting this vaudeville craze. And so you started getting a lot of theaters being built in downtown Denver that were vaudeville houses. And a lot of these ended up being converted into movie houses like the Orpheum here, which is, you see this picture from when it was sort of both. You see the vaudeville sign on there, but it was kind of also transitioning to become a movie theater in the silent movie era. And then you had probably the most incredible street in Denver at the time, which was Curtis Street. This was from about 16th to 18th approximately on Curtis Street. And this was Denver's Great White Way. It was an incredibly well-lit street which was the sort of the center of Denver nightlife in the 1920s. And so all these different theaters were built, and you can see some of them here. You can see the marquees like the Princess, the Isis, the Empress. These were all theaters in Denver that had kind of started out with that vaudeville craze and then transitioned into silent movies. And then, of course, you see in the front too the Tabor Grand, which was sort of the anchor of the whole strip of theaters on Curtis Street there. Tabor Grand had once of the other theaters had kind of taken over the live entertainment, they transitioned to a silent movie house as well. Here's another view of Curtis Street at night. It was not only theaters, but it was also, there were many restaurants. You could see, I think, a pool hall there on the side. So it was just kind of the center of Denver nightlife. Here's a view of some of the theaters. There's the Isis. They're incredibly ornate theaters, some of them. You can see they all had the marquees advertising the movies. There's the Empress. This was in the day of these sort of movie palaces where going to the movies was supposed to be a really sort of transporting experience. So you'll see all these different theaters had these sort of a lot of exotic themes or exotic architecture. It sort of gave that whole experience of new and different and being transported to another place. But then this happened. We had urban renewal in Denver in the 1950s, 60s, and this cleared out much of downtown, and most of those Curtis Street theaters went with it. The last theater that you would have seen in those photographs there was torn down in 1974. So by 1974, they were all gone. In the decade or so leading up to that, a lot of them had turned into like porno theaters, and the area had kind of really gone downhill. And that's why it was considered at that time, this was the time of the flight to the suburbs. And so Denver was considered kind of, downtown Denver was considered sort of sketchy and needing to be rehabilitated. And the idea was that if they could just wipe out all that old bad stuff and start over, then it wouldn't get rid of all the blight and put parking lots in, as you can see. So we're still working with that legacy here. But anyway, other downtown theaters besides Curtis Street, you can see here the view of 16th Street. We've got the Denver Theater and the Paramount there, two very different stories there. You have the Denver Theater, which I'll grab the address of that one right here. Sorry. the Denver Theater, 510 16th Street was the address. It opened up in 1927. So this was already into the movie era. This was not one of the converted vaudeville. This was already, this was built as a movie theater. You can see how elegant it was, the interior and the exterior. But unfortunately, it, like many other places in Denver in the 1960s, fell to the wrecking ball. You can see demolition photo there. And then we have a different story, which with the Paramount right across the street there, designed by famous architect Temple Buell, 1930. This was a great preservation story because unlike the Denver, this one we still have with us, and it is no longer a movie theater. It has now been converted to live entertainment, but we're really lucky to still have this beautiful Art Deco building today. Oops, went backwards. There's a early view of the interior of the Paramount here. And just another view after converted to stage theater. Shifting out of downtown to Capitol Hill, we had a lot of movie theaters along Colfax. Like you see here, the Bluebird Theater. This was designed by the architect, sorry, excuse me, is built by a druggist named Thompson. So it was originally named the Thompson Theater. It was built in 1913. And Thompson also built the Ogden Theater, also on Colfax. This was built in 1917. And this one was designed by another Ed Brooks. I mentioned Ed Brooks before, Frank Ed Brooks. This was designed by his nephew, Harry Ed Brooks. This one was designed, was opened as a movie theater in 1917 and continued as a movie theater until 1993 when it was converted over to a concert venue. Then the Aladdin is another of the great theaters on Colfax Avenue. This was located at Colfax and Race, if you know where that Walgreens is today. This was in that spot. And this opened in 1926, and this is a very historic theater because this was the first movie theater in Denver to show talkies. In fact, it was actually the first movie theater west of the Mississippi to show talkies. So a very historic place. It was also the scene of a premiere of one of the John Wayne movies, The Alamo. It's had its premiere here. So a lot of film history at this location. And then this was another one of these that was sort of supposed to be kind of exotic to, sort of transport you to another place. It was incredible. Inside it was painted all in sky blue and jade green and kind of give you that sort of Arabian Nights kind of feel. And it's supposed to be just a very special place for a night out. Even had a nursery, so if you didn't have to find a babysitter, you could just bring your kids, drop them off at the nursery, and then go to a movie. So they had thought of everything with this one. It was designed for movies, but it did also include a stage and an orchestra pit because it was from the silent era, so they would have the orchestra accompanying the movies, but they could also have live stage shows there as well, which sometimes they would do a program where they would have maybe a singer do a little concert and then have the movie after that sort of thing. But in 1984, this one was also lost. This was a big preservation battle to save this. The neighborhood organization, CHUN, Capitol Hill United Neighborhoods, banded together to save this. And they got it attempted to get it landmarked, but it was not approved in time, and unfortunately, it was lost. So you could see demolition photos from 1984. It was originally torn down for a condo complex. The developer wanted to build condos there, but then he was never actually able to get the financing for the condos, so it was kind of torn down for no reason. Then the Walgreens site came later to that site. So of course we have going down to First and Broadway there, the Mayan, which Andrea has already told you about, but this is another one of our incredible movie theaters in Denver, built in 1930. Very important during the Great Depression, when people kind of needed a little distraction during those difficult times. The Mayan was an important place at that time. You see, this is a picture from the 1920s. You could see on the marquee there some of the silent film era stars they were promoting: B.B. Daniels, Louis Stone, popular during the silent era. But again, this was another one that was supposed to be sort of an exotic feel to it. So instead of the sort of Middle Eastern Arabian like you had with the Aladdin, this one was Central South American, Mayan, Aztec kind of feel to it. And one thing I love about going there now is it's still got that. You know, you still see these great carvings on the wall, or reliefs on the wall of the, you know, sort of depicting that field. Still has the old ticket booth out in the outside, and you know, buy your ticket standing out on the sidewalk instead of going in, and it still has that old kind of 1930s feel to it, which is a lot of fun. Just another view of the Mayans. So that's what I have. I'd be happy to answer any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you so much for that, Amy. If anybody has any questions, feel free to kind of park them in the chat. And while we're waiting to see any, Amy, I didn't know if you just kind of wanted to share if you have a favorite theater in Denver, either standing or demolished, and why you like it.
Well, I'll give you two. So as far as still standing, I love the Mayan. I love to go to movies there. I've already been to a couple since COVID ended. And so that's always a fun place to go, as I mentioned, and kind of get that old feel. I think the one I'm most sad about being demolished is got to be the Tabor Grand. That was just such an incredible building. A lot of historians agree that was probably the finest building built in Denver. And just a real shame that we lost that one.
Yeah. And then we did have a question in the chat about theaters in Northwest Denver. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything or just mention.
Let me, what was it was the question just about generally about theaters?
It just says, what about theaters in Northwest Denver?
So there are, there's still the name is escaping me, but the one on Federal, that's still,
it's a church now, right? Victory Outreach or something.
Yeah.
That's the one you're thinking of.
Harry Huffman, who owned the Bluebird and the Ogden, he also had a theater over on the west side, on West Colfax, called the Bide-A-Wee Theater, BIDE-A-WEE, which I think is a Scottish phrase for stay a little while. Bide-A-Wee. He had that theater as well on West Colfax. So there was definitely some theaters on that side of town too.
Awesome. Other questions for Amy? Well, they're mentioning a couple others in Northwest Denver, the Oriental Theater.
Yeah, Oriental, that's the name I was trying to think of. Thank you.
And the Bug Theater.
And the Bug, yeah, that's always a fun one. Yep.
That is a great one. And then it's interesting, like, that they were kind of at a certain point all circled around like Curtis Street. Were there any other like groupings that we had previously where we had a lot of theaters in a smaller, like, it seems like from what you mentioned, something's happening on Colfax where there are a lot. Do we tend to see groupings, or does it seem like after the initial Curtis Street, they were more spread out?
It does seem like they were a little more spread out. You have some of the ones that were built in later decades, like you have the Esquire on 6th and Downing there, kind of in its own area, and you know, different ones. You didn't really have that that sort of theater. You kind of had that with other sort of theaters, like we had the Performing Arts Complex built, which ended up being at that kind of that other end of Curtis Street that kind of took that Curtis Street arts legacy. So you had that for the performing arts, but movie theaters did tend to be a little more spread out. And of course, when you had the suburbs, and then they, you know, movie theaters spread out all over the metro area, and so you didn't really kind of have that concentration anymore.
That makes sense. Oh, another comment just came in about another theater on Larimer.
Like, I am not familiar with that one.
I don't think I am either. Well, here's another question. Did the movie houses tend to be independently owned or owned by studios?
There was both. Studios, the Fox Studios owned a lot of them. I mentioned Harry Huffman. He was kind of a big theater owner in Denver. So you had kind of both.
So kind of some people that owned them, like owned a few. And then he was an independent owner and not a studio, right?
Correct. Yeah, he was local here in Denver. Yeah.
Gotcha. And then Mary Lou shared the Park Theater on South Gaylord.
Yeah.
These are all fun ones. If you guys are just like coming up with so many cool ones, if you want to throw a favorite in the chat and just share it with the group, I think that would be fun too. Because you're bringing up all kinds of fun theaters all across the city, which is really neat.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions for Amy about the history of kind of this progression from live theater to film? Then it's funny that so many of these film ones you mentioned went back to live. They're all concert venues today. It's kind of interesting, but I suppose, you know, we're always thinking about how you can reuse a historic building. There are only so many uses. It cannot be condos, I don't think. So it makes sense that it would go and continue to be some form of performing something. Let's give one more second, see if anybody else has anything for Amy. Awesome. And then are there any other kind of motifs that you saw in your research for historic? We kind of we've got the Mayan, we've got the Aladdin, and these are kind of two motifs, but were there any other common motifs that you noticed in theaters in Denver?
Some of the ones around on Curtis Street, I think kind of might have had like a sort of an Egyptian feel, like the Isis Theater was supposed to be kind of the Egyptian feel. The Oriental that was mentioned, of course, being more Asian. So they kind of did have all each one had sort of a different kind of exotic location or historical, you know, kind of feel to it, or something that they had picked for a theme. So. And then also you see in some of the names like the Princess Theater and the Empress Theater, and they, you know, this sort of feeling of royalty or, you know, elegance kind of too.
Yeah, I see. And then actually, so this is I think more an observation that came in the chat, but it is kind of interesting to think about that any area that used to have a major streetcar line may have been one of like had a movie theater. So Leah's saying that the building that's now Farrell's Sporting Goods on Tennyson was a movie theater, which is just down the street from the Oriental. And then the movie theater, there was a movie theater in the Cole neighborhood that was also near the streetcar stop. So that's actually kind of, yeah. I think, an interesting, you made we were talking about if they're kind of concentric or spread out. And that's an interesting way to think about, yeah, that maybe every few streetcar line stops, you needed to have a theater in your little neighborhood.
Yeah, and then it makes sense why you had them on streets like Colfax and Broadway and, you know, streets that have that.
Right, like the big arterial traffic ways through the city. Wonderful. Oh, and Mary Lou's sharing her favorite too are the Bug and the Alpine, which I don't think, Mary Lou, I don't think I know where the Alpine is. Is that also in Northwest Denver? Kind of a theme going?
No, I think the Bug and the Alpine were near Cole, and they were small theaters.
Okay.
Theaters, and there, you know, there's the Gothic and the Fox. Like you say, along a streetcar line or a major thoroughfare, you get these theaters, and they weren't very big.
Yeah. And actually then Pat and Ray added in the chat the Holiday Theater, which they're absolutely right. That was the theater on 32nd.
Still has a sign.
Yeah, it has a great sign and it has Egyptian murals inside.
Mm.
That one is, I think I'm like, it's contradicting what I said earlier, because I think that one actually is an interesting reuse of a theater. But I think it's a church, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a church today. Oh, and then James loves the Cooper Theater in Denver. Super fun. All right. Well, I don't think there's any other questions for Amy coming in, although if they are, we'll have plenty of time. But I'm going to kind of switch gears here and hand it over to Keith, who's going to talk a bit with us about what he thinks about theater or film in Denver today.
Thanks, guys. And yeah, I don't have a presentation so much as just, I suppose, a little bit of reacting to Amy's really thorough, fantastic presentation of this history, and to just sort of tell my own little dealings with theaters in Denver. I've been part of the movie theater community since I was like professionally, since I was about 17. My very first job was working at the AMC Colorado Plaza 6 on Colorado and Alameda, not a historic movie house by any stretch, but a multiplex, when multiplexes were the thing that sort of debuted in the 80s, putting more than just like 2 or 3 screens in the theater. But I always kind of had a nice history of my area, being born and raised in Denver. The Mayan was, of course, first and foremost, top of the list for the neatest place to go see a movie, and learning about the history of that being saved in the early 80s was definitely added a lot of shine to that building. And I would later, in the 90s, 1996 to 2001, I started to work at the Mayan Theater and then became the house manager there for about 3 years. So I have a very intimate relationship with the inner workings of that place, and plenty of stories about the architecture, which was definitely a challenge to keep up in modern times, especially because it should be laid out too, because I think there's oftentimes some confusion about Landmark Theaters as a corporation, which operates the Mayan, the Esquire, the Chez Artistes. They do no preservation for any of their theaters. They are merely the corporation that programs films within the theater. Though Landmark Theaters, they got their name because they began, their initial moving into theaters was to sort of save, actually I should not say save, to energize saved historic buildings, saved historic theaters over the years since the early 80s. And so Landmark Theaters, operating in these older theaters, did not necessarily have a budget to maintain these places as much as they had to for renting the theaters from the actual property owners, which those theaters are always, I wouldn't say they're in danger of, but that is the scales. Like Landmark Theaters does not own any of those historic theaters. They merely rent the spaces. And that became apparent news to people when during COVID, the Esquire was up for sale in 2020. And there was a lot of ballyhoo about what was going to happen to that place. And Amy, I don't know if you know this or not, but there is no landmark distinction on the Esquire Theater, is there? It's just known as a historic building, but there's no actual landmark, literal.
That's correct, yeah.
And that was kind of a big cause for alarm for a lot of folks. That property did end up selling to new owners. Landmark is still operating the theater as they came out of COVID, but what those new owners and their intentions and plans for that space, we will hopefully, we'll learn eventually. But the Esquire, I believe, is also older than the Mayan by, I think, 8 or 9 years, something around there. perhaps no real architectural distinction for the Esquire, which I think is one of the reasons why it probably doesn't have landmark status, is it's kind of just a box of a building versus its sister, the Mayan, which, you know, has this grand, you know, levels. It seems like it's 40 stories tall when you're outside of the Mayan theater, which is much like the movies, The Hollywood Within. There's, you know, little secrets. It almost feels like a movie set when you're actually in the guts of the Mayan, because like especially where there's the Mayan person with the jewel in their head at the very top. That's on the edge of the roof. If you were to climb on the roof, and the jewel is actually in a little kind of, it's like a little it's a room that's not used for anything, but it's a structure more than anything, but kind of built like a set, like, well, we're just going to have this giant thing over the top of it. And a lot of that stained glass that runs down the middle alongside that marquee is actually boarded up at this moment, but was within the spaces of the projection booth for the theater, which the upstairs booth was the main theater back when that place used to have a balcony instead of two theaters upstairs in its original incarnation. So I've always wondered what that place really looked like back then, what it was like to see a movie when it was just one whole cohesive unit, where the movie came all the way from the top down into the screen, and you could be in the balcony and enjoy it as well.
So, Keith, sorry to interrupt, but are you saying
Yeah.
like, because that was stained glass behind the projection booth, that if you were outside in the dark and a movie was playing, it would actually like light from the film?
Well, that would be a problem if it truly was like, that's the question, is whether or not back in the day that it was like that and they just had a way of shuttering it during daytime hours. But when you really get up close to it, you can see that there's just boards that run alongside of it. And the projection booth itself over the years has been like built into along that wall, where one would imagine that you know, what that actually, I'm going to take this back, because I know that that booth was also designed for nitrate film. It's an original incarnation, which nitrate film, when that used to be operated back in the 20s and 30s, is highly flammable. And a lot of those booths that would play nitrate film were kind of like covered in iron and steel, and had these massive things that would shut the projection windows with an iron door. And the booth could be also, the projectionist could run out and lock the booth, and it'd also be another iron door that would keep, if there was a fire to be started, because nitrate film is incredibly flammable, and then running along a heat source of the projector. Occasionally, as I guess as an odd delight to folks, would ignite and could potentially burn a whole movie theater down. But if it were to catch a fire, the projectionist would just literally shut all these shutters, these iron shutters, flee the booth, and then the fire could be contained within that projection booth and smothered, and then go on another day. But yeah, that was always a question I had with that stained glass, is what parts of the building perhaps had that visible through, and if there was any. This would be something that you know, Chris Citrone, when they were going in there in their first pass through to save that building and remodel it or return it to its original state, what the status of that like stained glass pull up would have been. But yeah, so that's the Mayan. Other than that, I mean, you know, currently the Sea Film Center, not a historic theater as well. We're 10 years old as us operating the Sea Film Center. The building was erected probably like 5 years before that, as a just blank, no name movie theater, just a shell with 3 spaces for 3 screens and an audience. Operated by a group called Neighborhood Flicks right after that, and then us as Denver Film at the Sea Film Center shortly thereafter as well. We used to operate the Stars Film Center, which was in the Tivoli building over on the Auraria campus. That was another build out of a multiplex by AMC in the 80s. There were 12 screens there at the time when we were operating it. We didn't operate all 12, being art house as our main content. We often couldn't find that many films to do, but we tried our best. And but the building that it was housed in within itself, the Tivoli Brewery, was far more historic than the Stars Film Center ever was, or the Tivoli AMC. And yes, we would run all 12 screens at the Tivoli during the film festival. The film festival is 44 years old this year. Started in 1977, and first starting at a few what remaining big movie palaces were around, including the Paramount, the Aladdin, the Ogden. Those were kind of the main screening rooms. Eventually, when the Tivoli came about in the 80s, the Denver Film Festival would operate 12 of the screens there for the festival for about 11 days. And we did that up until we moved out of that space 10 years ago. So yes, good point on that. Whoever just asked that. Leah, thank you. But yeah, I mean, some of the things we were just talking about with like favorite theaters. Yeah, the Holiday Theater on 32nd and Clay was a favorite walk-by theater of mine when I was younger. It was closed for the longest time, so it was just one of those that I could see and just wonder what was inside. The Federal Theater on Federal and 38th, I believe, nearby, was another one of those that I wished I could have seen movies in as a kid. And yeah. The Cooper, as brought up, is probably to your question about what is my favorite movie theater, either living or not. I saw so many notable films of my youth at the Cooper, and really understanding the architectural structure of a Cooper theater, which I don't know if people understand that, but it's designed in the 60s as circles. Like the theater itself was built round, so the screen was actually curved and half of the circle, and circles were part of the soundproofing and all sorts of stuff. And, oop, my light went out. That's very odd. Whoop, can y'all hear me still? Okay.
Yes, we can still hear you.
Don't know why it got so spooky all of a sudden. But yes, so yeah, the Cooper was torn down to be the Barnes and Noble that is over there off of Colorado Boulevard now. But was always, yeah, I think every notable film I saw as a kid was at the Cooper, and I do miss that theater a whole lot. And sorry to get so spooky, just trying to figure out this light source.
That's okay. It's like you're watching a movie right now.
Exactly.
Because you're kind of like that blue that the film casts over.
We'll do the shutter of the movie right here.
Yeah, exactly. I'm kind of curious, Keith. It sounds like you've worked in theaters and historic buildings. You know, the C Film Center is a much more modern. Like, do you have a preference? And do you have any, like, since you already have the mood lighting, do you have any future predictions of like what movie houses of the future, maybe like, or amenities people will expect them to have?
You know, it's interesting because I do feel there is kind of a full circle element kind of rolling around to a less is more attitude. Right now, and a lot of this has to do with, I guess, comfort is one of the main things that movie theaters these days strive for. That's what they try to attract their audiences with, because the big competition is people's homes and every comfort that they have there, their couch, their bed, whatever. So what are you going to do to make it special to see a movie out to leave your house? And so recliners have become a gigantic offering in modern movie theaters these days, and installing a lot of movie theaters, if you may have noticed over the last, I'd say even 5 years, began taking out old theater seats and adding recliners. And what this actually does is reduces the amount of seats in a theater. But part of this is a shrinking down to the notion that not as many people are going out to the movies as they once used to. So the Esquire Theater was around 400 seats, I believe. And then they had their big remodel just before the pandemic, unfortunately. And they got new seats for that theater, and they lost, they were not recliners, but they were rocker backs. They were a much larger seat. And I feel like they lost about 200 seats in that auditorium, 150 to 200 seats, which just goes to show there's not a worry that taking out that many seats to your bottom line is that right now there just aren't that many people coming to theaters. So less 24 plexes, less 16 plexes being built, because there just isn't that much content to be put on all these screens, or the need for multiple theaters when you have a big sellout of a movie, which, you know, what that speaks to the movie industry as a whole is a bigger question that I feel like we're not going to see any real results in for another decade or so. But right now, the current status, especially coming out of a pandemic where all these venues were mostly shuttered, and some of them did reopen under very, very, very limited capacities. You know, the Sea Film Center, we didn't reopen during the pandemic at all, except to do private screenings with a limited capacity of about 10 people per show. And we are currently not open at the moment. We will reopen in just a couple of months. We're taking our time and doing some really cool things, so we'll make announcements about that shortly. But I think the multiplex itself is on its last leg, as that a more comfortable offering of 6 theaters in a new venue. If you look at the new Colorado AMC, Colorado Boulevard AMC, there are 10 screens, and half of them are very small, intimate houses with about 40 to 50 seats. And that's another tell of creating the space for an audience to feel that they're in a good, nice, comfortable space, as opposed to a gigantic multiplex, a cavern of sorts. That way, I personally would love to see balconies come back to some of these places. I'd love to see a new build of a theater where a balcony was a consideration. I just think there's such a coolness about a balcony that so much the generation of the last 40 years really has no idea about when it comes to a movie theater. So
Yeah, do you have a feel for when that stopped being? Because you're right, in any historic theater, there typically are.
I mean, it was around the time of the multiplex boom. When the Mayan was saved and Landmark moved in to operate it, they had to think business-wise, and the business-wise was that they needed more than one screen. They needed 3. And so in order to do that, they had to shut off the balcony and literally split it and add a wall in front of the balcony, and that became your second and third theater. And this is how, I mean, that's the Esquire did the same thing. The Esquire's balcony used to also exist, but that became one more theater up there. And yeah, it was an 80s technique to basically say, we need more screens, we need more screens, we need more screens when the movies sell out. We need all this stuff. But then, yeah, I feel the multiplex build out probably started to become insignificant in the early 2000s is probably when people really started staying at home more, watching movies. And then 2010 was when Netflix and all those streaming services began really taking a step forward. And I think that was the next eventual evolution of where movie theaters were kind of going.
Yeah.
Oh, hey.
I did think it was interesting. I don't think we realized this when we planned it, but the Cannes Film Festival is going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
And so they had a bunch of interviews with, actors and actresses that are attending, and they're all talking about how much difference the experience is in a theater to viewing something at home, to streaming on a small screen. I mean, do you have a horse in that race?
We during the pandemic, we were one of the first film organizations in the country to jump on board what's now called virtual cinema. And it came out of the week we closed, Monday, March 16th of 2020. We closed for a few weeks, and we got a call from a film distributor, Kino Lorber, and they were like, "Hey, we don't know what this is going to look like, what this pandemic's going to do, this lockdown, how long it's going to take, but we have a digital platform, and we'd love to be able to work with you to show films and share revenue and have it come through you, and you can engage your customers and do all that." And for about 3 months, we worked with many film distributors, including Kino Lorber, on it had its pros and cons of how it really worked. It was a lot of sending people to different sites and all this stuff, but a way at least of engaging folks and letting them watch new movies in the comfort of their own home, which no one could leave. And by that summer, we decided to take the plunge on a platform of our own that we could manage and that we could work on the ticketing from, and we could upload films to, and all that stuff. And that was a really great thing. And we also had a lot of good success. We did the film festival last year virtually through that platform. So we could present, over 150 films to folks anywhere in Colorado, and some films across the country. And it's definitely a very interesting challenge now, because as movie theaters are reopening, people have screen fatigue for sure. No one really wants to watch things on their phones, on their TVs that much anymore, unless they're really, really locked down to it. And so showing them new movies, they're like, well, I can go outside and go to a place and see a movie nowadays. But there was a lot of things that came out of this experiment, and a lot of it too was accessibility was a new thing, which I think pandemic living really taught us a lot about accessibility to everyone, but especially what a lot of folks who can't leave their homes, who it's hard for them to get around. All these things could really, we've been saying this for years, and it took a pandemic to get everyone on board with this. But the notion that we could use our virtual cinema to reach people who can't come to the movie theater, who have never had the opportunity to make their way down, or just given any health concern or just anything, don't have the means to always travel back and forth to a theater or do any of that stuff. We now have a platform that we can go out to people with in the comfort of their own home. It's going to be a sidebar here in the coming months after we reopen, but I'm really excited to look at what that is an additional support, not as a focus. I never want to leave big screens. That's definitely paramount, is to not ever lose that ability to have a movie theater, have screens, and have all that stuff. But having a supplemental virtual element, I think, is very beneficial, and we're just going to figure out what that looks like as an assist to the bigger picture. But for right now, and for a while still, I mean, movie theaters will be here to stay. There's just definitely a lot of tweaks and everything we're going to go through for the next few years coming back from this pandemic, for sure.
I think that's a good point too, especially when we think about historic movie theaters that traditionally probably have some accessibility issues anyway, for some of these historic movie theaters. What do you think is the future then for historic movie theaters within this changing landscape of just movie theaters in general?
Well, I mean, I sure hope that historic movie theaters can stick around for sure. I hate redevelopment into things that take away a lot of what the place was. Oh my goodness, why am I forgetting the name of it? The Weber Theater, which is on South Broadway, which is now a distillery. It's at Broadway, South Broadway, and Maple. Is that where that is? Uh, Most people remember it because it was this way for about 20 some years as Kitty South, a porn theater and arcade there. But a distillery group came to buy it probably about 8 years ago, maybe a little bit longer. And they restored the front and the exterior of the building to look like the Weber used to look, including its marquee in its original incarnation. But the inside is not at all like a theater one bit. It's an entertainment space. It's a party space. Um, to me, the most unforgivable thing they did is that there used to be this really great tile that even in front of Kitty South, as ratty as Kitty South got, you could look down in front of that theater in the concrete, and there was tile at the doorway that was said it spelled out the Weber in that tile. And one of the first things they did was remove all that tile and never put it back. So to me, I was like, there's an intention here, but at the same time, there's a loss of kind of like the soul of what I think they really should have been going for in that place. But that's just my opinion on specifically that place. But I mean, in order to save a lot of these places, they will have to be redeveloped into something. It's much like the conversations we're having about places like Tom's Diner, where they wanted to sell that place, and it got, I can't remember, it was a back and forth of it was trying to get historic status put on it, but then the owner did not want that, and eventually it did get historic status, I think, and then the decision was made from the new developers that they were going to keep the building because it's architecturally, that's what's historic about it, is the architectural style of that place. But then pandemic also kind of may have skewered the next plan to keep that alive within the context of whatever development they were going to do on top of it. But when it comes to movie theaters, with the Esquire, like how that was a danger of almost, could have been sold to anyone, last year during the pandemic. No one would have had any idea, and except learning like, oh, the Esquire is not coming back because it's about to become like a grocery store or something. um it's just a matter of figuring out how to use the space in a way that hopefully is as a movie theater, but is there another way to expand upon that to maybe have a movie theater but something additionally more sustainable? I mean, the one of the problems per se of historic movie theaters is that they play art house film and not blockbusters. And so it's already a niche audience, which is having a lot of their needs met with Netflix and streaming sites and stuff like that. And I mean, the Sea Film Center is one of these art houses, but we very intricately program our film to engage the community as opposed to passively just throwing movies on screen and hoping people come to see them. We're working with the community to get them in, to really energize our space. But yes, a lot of these older theaters are rooted in art house independent film, and so it's just that kind of question of like how, if you can keep that type of a theater running, but then add another business on top of it that helps boost the energy of people coming. It's sort of along the lines of creating, losing the balcony and creating extra screens. Is like, okay, well, what's the next step of this space, to make it something that is additionally attractive to a whole new audience, or to keeping the business running. And like I mentioned before with like Landmark Theaters, is they don't own those spaces. The Mine and the Esquire can be sold at any time once, if the property owners decide that there's a reason to. And at least for the Esquire, I believe they hadn't paid their rent for a year and a half or something like that, and it was sort of a default, like, well, then we're selling you. How viable that kind of space is to property owners is the other thing, and I guess what the value of those places is. I imagine right now, with the value of everything in Baker on South Broadway, the Mine is worth the space the Mayan occupies is worth a lot of money. The Mayan, of course, is priceless. That's just, we'll just say that right there. But that is the question. Does that become, do they sell the Mayan to, when the lease is up, do they sell it to someone who's creating a wacky restaurant entertainment idea? And they can't gut it because there's landmark status on it, but they work within the confines of the architecture to create a space that's not a movie theater, but exists in the same aspects of a movie theater. And so that's the bigger question, at least for a historic space like that. And as we've seen, we've lost so many of these other places. And the Holiday, the Federal, those have all become church worship spaces, but that always seems temporary. I always feel like, at least the Federal Theater on Federal, growing up, was, after it stopped showing movies, it was either a carpet warehouse or a church, and then a carpet warehouse again or a church. And it was just like a weird back and forth of like, who needs these spaces and what they're going to use with them. You take out all the seats to a movie theater, you've got a great storage space, but certainly not utilizing that building to the best of its ability, to the best of its attractive historic ability. So.
Yeah, and I wonder, and maybe this is for Amy and Keith, but if you've seen theaters like the Mayan and the Oriental, I mean, I think I just got an email today about the Byers Library being renamed. If there is some way that we need to help interface what was happening in the 30s, where we're kind of putting these exotic motifs on things, with how we kind of think about things today and make our language as inoffensive as possible.
I don't think they were meant to offend anybody. I think they were kind of meant to sort of celebrate those cultures and stuff. And I think it's also part of our own culture that historically, in the 20s and 30s, that was kind of a thing. The thing to do is sort of copy those other cultures, and so that's sort of our own cultural history part of that too. And that's kind of a way of explaining it.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at what happened to the Aladdin, I mean, that was also the 80s, I believe, right? Or like the very tail end of the set. Yeah,
I
the
think it
80s.
was,
I mean, that was a condo disaster. Like, we will still deal with a similar situation at some point in the next 10 years, I'm sure, with a historic building like this, where it's like, yes, we're putting condos in. And then, oops, we didn't have the money for the condos. So now it's just, sorry, we knocked that place down for no reason. Like, we're going to have these heartbreak stories always. But especially when it comes to these last remaining historic theaters, like, especially ones that, like, I think about the ones over off of Tennyson, in that area, where there's just such a build out there that, yes, people have their right spot in their heart to be like, yeah, we don't have to tear it down, but it's going to become an outdoor gear store or this space or whatever. And then you just start looking eventually for, one of my favorite things to do in like historic parts of Denver is look for the bones of a movie theater, where you see a space that you're like, I can see where the projection booth was there. I can see where the box office used to be. I forget, on super South Broadway, there was a climbing gym that used to be a movie theater at some point. You
it's
could
called
tell.
Thrill Seekers. Yeah, you're
Yeah,
absolutely right. It's just
where
by
they,
Evans.
yeah, they had a marquee. You could see where the box office used to be. You could see the upstairs area where I'm sure someone went and did projection. That, I don't know the historic level of that. That seems more like a theater that was probably built in the 50s or 60s. But yeah, I often just look around in these parts of town and I'm just like, okay, what did this place used to be? And I feel like movie theaters are the biggest skeletons of them all that way, because there were so many for so long, and then they were all just torn down in one big sweep, or forgotten about for forever. I know off of South Pearl in Denver that there was the Vogue Theater, which was a very, very tiny one screen little space that I believe has turned into a restaurant or something else, but literally is not any more of what it used to look like. But we're just gonna have to see.
Yeah. And there was another question in the chat. Amy, I don't know if you want to weigh in. I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. asking if the Mayan does have local landmark status, right? I'm pretty positive it does, even if
Yes.
it's not showing up on their map on the website.
Yeah, there's the little historic landmark plaque is embedded on the front of the Mayan if you go there, just by the front door.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for putting your questions in the chat here. If there are more for either Keith or Amy, this is a great time to throw them in there. So we're getting close to the end. We've had really a fascinating chat with both our speakers tonight. So it's a good time for like last questions, last thoughts, anything you're still wondering about and are curious of how these two will take the past, present, or future of movies in Denver.
Keith, do you have something coming up that you're really excited about for Sea Film Center?
I mean, our reopening is very exciting. You know, we and much to the chagrin, if we have any members of Denver Film or lovers of the Sea Film Center in this discussion tonight, you know, we've been doing our best this whole pandemic to try to engage everyone. And like I said, virtual cinema was our biggest. This is the easiest thing we can do without an actual building. That and having private screenings, when we're still offering those right now, where you know, you and a bunch of your friends can rent out a screen and watch whatever you want, and we'll provide the popcorn and soda and the space and the environment and try to make it as much like going back to the movies as possible. But we didn't see a reason to jump so quickly as most other corporations. I mean, we're a nonprofit. Let's always remember that too, first and foremost. You know, these film corporations had to reopen because they had such a loss from millions of dollars of revenue that they just didn't have access to in 2020. And the minute that they could have access to any of this stuff, even with limitations of, you know, most theaters, for a while you couldn't have more than 25 people in the auditorium in any of those big houses. It eventually moved up to 50, and I believe now it is at full capacity, although I think that's dependent on certain counties and also theater chains deciding for themselves what they want their capacities to be. But we just saw so much cost that gets thrown into that, and by that I mean you're paying a staff, you're paying projectionists, you're operating the building, and we get to see the grosses that all these movies have at the movie theaters, and it's not covering anyone's bills for these corporations. I'm not entirely sure how they do it. I see it just as a lot of work to, yes, bring movies back to an audience. I just still feel we're still months away from a lot of people feeling comfortable being back at the movies. And I know a lot of folks on this also may have already taken their steps into movie theaters. I have myself. I do go to the movies. I try to go once a week in this new easing out of the pandemic that we're going through. But we just wanted to make sure we did it right. We have some exciting things to announce in the coming very soon about our reopening. Obviously, there was news today that the 44th Denver Film Festival will be in person this year, this November 3rd to the 14th. We will be back at the Sea Film Center there, and an additional venue along with the L.A. Calkins Opera House and other places around town that we have in the past. We'll also have a virtual element connected to that festival. But just before then, the Sea will reopen, and we'll have a lot of really great things to talk about, and a really great month of programming before we go into the festival, I think. Planning some really big things. So that's what I'm most excited about right now.
Fabulous. Thank you. Amy, I don't know if we heard from you. What sort of, is there a historic theater that we maybe lost that you would really have loved the opportunity to see a film in?
Yeah, I think there's several. I did mention the Tabor Grand before, but I think any of the ones on Curtis Street, I think it would have been so fun to be able to see Curtis Street Theater Row and all lit up and in its heyday there. I think that would have been a lot of fun. So yeah, some great theaters that have been lost in Denver, but we're also lucky that we've had some of them be saved as well, still with us.
And then Amy, I don't know if you saw, there was a question about drive-ins in Denver. I think folks on the call came up with one or two already, but I didn't know if you had a strong, any that you wanted to mention too.
Yeah, no, looks like, yeah, a couple have already mentioned the one on Hampton and Santa Fe there, which was lasted actually very long. I'm gonna say it was about 10 years ago or so that lasted until, until well into the 2000s. So I can even remember going to that one. So.
Just to answer some of these questions someone directed at me. Hey, thank you. Yes, we did our own drive-in at Film on the Rocks during the pandemic, which was really at Red Rocks, which was a lot of fun and something we would like to do again in the future. We're going to see how that operates in a post-pandemic world next summer. Even if there's a new space that we can create our own kind of thing for permanently. That wasn't an announcement, that's just a dream. Yes, we did unfortunately have to lay off all of our floor staff and a few people within the admin staff also. There was an ebb and flow of roles at Denver Film, but we have a really good core team which stuck through the entirety of all these troubles. And like I said, we're really excited to come back, to bring back more people that we lost employment wise, and just kind of get back on the horse for 2022.
I think we're excited too. I think I did my first movie a couple weeks ago. So it is nice to finally get back to the movies. And hopefully we look forward to the film festival coming up and all the great things you have. And Amy, thank you for your amazing presentation and learning more about some of these great historic places. It sounds to me like 1984 was a tough year on movie houses in Denver. That seems to be when a lot of them hit the wrecking ball, or when the Mayan was very closely saved from the wrecking ball. So let's hope we don't have another 1984 for movie theaters here in Denver.
Interestingly, that was also one of the best years for movies. 1984. So obviously that was when the big multiplexes were starting to steal some business.
Allison, I thought I'd quick throw up our next Empowered by Place, and as we take any last questions and wrap up.
Yeah, that's a great idea. As always, we love having these conversations with you guys. And so keeping with our schedule, the next one is scheduled for September 2nd, and we'll start at 7 p.m. for that one as well. Wonderful. Well, if no one has any other questions, we just thank everyone for the conversation tonight. And then especially thank you to Amy and Keith for your research and your thoughts and your expertise. It was wonderful to talk with both of you. And thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.
Bye.